at 6:41 on the morning of August 12, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Hale sat strapped into the cockpit of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt on a rain-soaked airfield outside Duxford, England, staring at a fuel gauge that was already betraying him and an instrument panel that half the men in his squadron believed was attached to the most dangerous fighter ever issued to an American pilot. A plane so heavy, so oversized, and so temperamental that British mechanics openly called it a flying coffin, and German pilots mocked it as a clumsy metal ox that could never survive a real dogfight. Yet that morning, Bobby Hale was ordered to take it straight into the heart of occupied Europe on a deep penetration escort mission no American fighter had yet proven it could survive, a mission that would push the Thunderbolt beyond its design limits and drag one young pilot into the deadliest hour of his life. Hale was 22 years old, fresh from Texas flight school with only 48 combat hours logged and exactly 0 confirmed kills. And already he carried the reputation of a man who flew the wrong fighter, because while the sleek British Spitfire sliced through the sky with elegance, and the new P-51 Mustang whispered promises of speed and range, the P-47 was a brute, nearly 7 tons at full load, with a massive radial engine that drank fuel like it was trying to drown itself, and wings so thick pilots joked you could land a jeep on them, and worst of all, early combat reports said it burned through fuel so fast that men were ditching into the channel before they could even make it home, which is why the veterans said the same thing to every new Thunderbolt pilot. The Germans won't kill you. The fuel gauge will. Hale had heard that sentence more times than he could count, in briefing rooms, over cigarettes in the mess hall, whispered before takeoff like a curse that followed the sound of the engine itself. And still, as the Thunderbolt shook under the startup torque of its 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engine, Hale pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft surge down the wet runway like an angry locomotive, because he had no choice, because the mission order sitting folded in his chest pocket gave him no room for fear. Only coordinates and fuel limits and strict instructions not to turn back unless the engine physically failed. And ahead of him, climbing into the gray English sky, were 42 more Thunderbolts forming into escort layers around a stream of American B-17 bombers, heading for a target so deep inside Germany that no American escort had yet proved it could reach it and return intact. The Thunderbolt climbed slowly, laboriously, its massive turbo-supercharger whining like a tortured animal as it struggled to drag the aircraft toward 25,000 feet, and inside the cockpit, Hale could feel every vibration, every shudder of metal stress, every gulp of fuel being ripped from the tanks beneath his seat, and as he formed up on his wingman, Captain Lewis Grant, a veteran with 3 confirmed kills who had already lost 2 friends to fuel starvation, Grant's voice cracked over the radio, calm and cold. "Stick close, Bobby. Don't chase. This thing can fight, but it can't forgive," Hale acknowledged, eyes fixed on his gauges, on the temperature needles creeping upward, on the fuel slowly sinking as the English coast slipped behind them, and the gray lid of the channel opened beneath their formation, like a steel coffin waiting to be filled with wreckage. The Germans were already tracking them. By the time the bomber stream crossed the French coast, Luftwaffe radar stations along the Atlantic Wall had already sent alerts racing across the continent, and fighter groups from bases in Belgium and Western Germany began scrambling to altitude, climbing hard into intercept positions where sunlight would blind the Americans and gravity would give the Germans the first strike, and Hale could feel the tension shift inside the cockpit long before he saw a single enemy aircraft because the bombers tightened formation. Defensive gun turrets slewed outward like nervous animals, and the Thunderbolts above and below him began sliding into high cover and drag positions, the silent choreography of aerial survival unfolding exactly as his instructors had taught him. Because when the enemy finally appeared, there would be no time left to think, only to react, and Hale had not yet killed a single man in the air. The first German fighters broke through at Sa-2, streaking down from the sun in a screaming vertical dive that slammed into the bomber formation like thrown knives, and within seconds the sky erupted into interwoven chaos, tracer fire stitching through cloud gaps, B-17s shuddering as 20-meter rounds tore through aluminum skin, parachutes blossoming and spinning away, and Thunderbolts ripping downward to intercept, as Hale instinctively rolled left and shoved the throttle forward, feeling the full weight of the aircraft surge behind him as he dove toward a dark green Messerschmitt that was lining up on a crippled bomber below. And in that moment, Hale forgot every insult ever thrown at his aircraft and felt only the raw physics of mass and speed as the P-47 plunged like a falling building. Gravity turning its weight into a weapon as his airspeed screamed past 400 miles per hour, and the German pilot realized too late that the flying coffin behind him was about to become a hammer. Hale squeezed the trigger. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted in unison, the recoil vibrating through the entire airframe as streams of tracers reached across the sky and shredded into the Messerschmitt's fuselage, tearing off its canopy, detonating the engine and blasting the entire nose section into fire and fragments, the German fighter disintegrating in less than 2 seconds of sustained fire as Hale tore through the wreckage at such speed that pieces of burning metal struck his wings and fuselage like thrown gravel. And as he pulled up, gasping, hands shaking on the stick, his radio crackled with Grant's stunned voice. "That's one, Bobby. That's one." Hale barely had time to register the words before a second German fighter slashed across his canopy at close range, cannon shells hammering through his left wing and ripping through the Thunderbolt's skin with explosive force that would have shredded lighter aircraft. But the P-47 absorbed the damage like armor, bleeding fuel and oil but remaining airborne, and Hale reacted on instinct alone, rolling inverted and diving again as the German tried to climb away, only to discover that the clumsy Thunderbolt, once committed to a dive, was a falling anvil that nothing in the sky could outrun straight down. The Thunderbolt caught the second fighter 3,000 feet lower, 8 guns roaring again, and this time Hale saw the pilot bail out, his parachute tearing open as the shattered aircraft spiraled into the clouds below. And 2 kills now burned in Hale's mind like a fever, as his fuel gauge dropped faster than it ever had before, and the sky around him filled with more contacts than he could count. Focke-Wulf slashing through the bomber stream, Thunderbolts plunging to intercept, bombers burning, chutes opening, wreckage falling endlessly into unseen Europe, and Hale realized with terrifying clarity that he was now deep inside the fight, isolated from his squadron, with enemy fighters above and below him, and less than half his fuel remaining with hundreds of miles still between him and England. By Niwi, Hale had downed Ihidai 3 Dubangniu enemy aircraft. By Idu 9 Twami Fania, the number climbed to Sekdius 5 Ismaius. Each engagement followed the same brutal pattern, and German fighters attempted vertical attacks on the bombers, trusting that their lighter aircraft could escape upward after the strike, and each time, Hale hurled the Thunderbolt downward like a thrown building, using gravity to turn his aircraft's weakness into a killing advantage. The thick wings holding together through dive speeds that tore enemy planes apart, the engine screaming but never failing, his ammunition belts shrinking with frightening speed, as smoke, flame, and falling men filled the sky around him. And still, the fuel gauge dropped. At Instinct 41, low on ammunition and nearly out of fuel, Hale broke contact and pointed his battered Thunderbolt west toward the channel, believing the mission was over, believing he had survived, believing he would return as a man who had proven the death trap could fight. When 3 Focke-Wulfs exploded out of the cloud layer ahead of him, perfectly positioned for a frontal interception, their cannons already flashing as Hale slammed the throttle forward on instinct he no longer fully trusted, and in that moment, with bullets tearing through the air around him and his fuel needle hovering near empty, Hale understood exactly what it meant to be flying a machine that everyone else had already given up on, and he dove straight at them. At 9:42 on the morning of August 12, 1943, 3 Focke-Wulf 190s came straight at Robert Hale's P-47 in a classic head-on intercept. Dark gray crosses sharp against the white tops of the clouds, cannon flashes already sparkling along their wings as Hale shoved the Thunderbolt's throttle as far forward as it would go, and felt the big Pratt & Whitney engine roar in protest, the entire airframe shuddering as the airspeed indicator surged, and in that split second, he understood that turning away was suicide. If he broke, they would rake him from behind and tear him apart, but if he held his course and trusted the weight and firepower of the death trap, his own mechanics cursed on the ground, he might punch through them before they could react, so he did the one thing that made sense in a sky where nothing made sense at all. He pointed 7 tons of metal and fuel straight at 3 German fighters and didn't blink. The distance closed like a closing fist. 1,000 yards, 800, 600. Tracers streaked past his canopy, one round hammering into the armored glass in front of his face with a spiderweb crack that turned the world ahead into distorted shards of sky and flashing gunfire. Hale bit down on the urge to flinch. At 400 yards, he rolled a few degrees left, enough to throw off their line just a hair, and mashed the trigger. 8 .50 caliber guns spat fire, the recoil surging up through his arms as a storm of bullets reached out in a blazing cone. The lead Focke-Wulf flew right into it. Its engine cowling exploded in a sickening blossom of smoke and metal, the propeller tearing free as the entire fighter jerked sideways, wings shearing off, the pilot vanishing in a flash of debris as the wreck tumbled under Hale's nose, so close he could see the torn remnants of the black cross spinning away. The second Focke-Wulf yanked hard right, trying to escape the collision. Hale tracked him for a heartbeat and stitched a line of rounds through his wing root. The aircraft rolled violently, trailing smoke, pilot fighting to bail out as the third fighter flashed past. So close, Hale saw the German's goggles and the shock in his eyes before they were gone. Before the sky behind him erupted with their return fire as the survivor wheeled around for another attack. Hale's Thunderbolt lurched, the left wing juddering as cannon shells punched through it, tearing aluminum and fuel lines and sending a fine mist of gasoline streaming into the slipstream. Warning lights glowed on his panel. Fuel pressure flickered, then steadied, then flickered again. The engine temperature gauge crept toward the red. Hale swore under his breath, rolled the aircraft into a defensive turn, and checked his 6. The remaining Focke-Wulf was there, glued to his tail, cannons spitting in short, disciplined bursts. Lighter fighters, Hale had been told, would always win in a turning fight, but the Thunderbolt wasn't meant to dance. It was meant to dive and hit like a hammer. He yanked the stick back just enough to climb, baiting the German into a vertical chase, and then shoved it forward. Gravity grabbed the P-47 and dragged it down like a dropped safe. Airspeed screamed past 380, then 400, then 420. The wings hummed with the onset of compressibility, the thick surfaces flirting with the edges of control lockup as Hale forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his hand gentle on the stick even as vibrations threatened to rip it from his grip. Behind him, the Focke-Wulf tried to follow and discovered the truth Thunderbolt pilots were just starting to understand. When the P-47 dove, nothing caught it head-on. The German silhouette swelled in Hale's rearview mirror, then shrank, then wavered as the enemy pilot fought his own compressibility, air rushing around his thinner wings in a way that threatened to snap them clean off if he forced the dive any further. Hale eased back on the stick, felt the P-47 respond sluggishly but steadily, and rolled out low under the cloud layer, the altimeter unwinding madly. He leveled at 12,000 feet, breathing hard, eyes scanning for the German. For a moment, there was nothing but empty cloud gaps and smoke trails. Then he saw him. The Focke-Wulf had broken out of his own dive below Hale, pulling into a climbing turn to regain altitude and set up another pass. Perfect. Hale pushed the nose down slightly and began a wide, descending turn, using the extra weight of the Thunderbolt to accelerate in a shallow spiral that put him above and outside the German's arc. The P-47 was not graceful, but it had momentum, and momentum was another word for stored violence. As the Focke-Wulf completed half his climbing circle, Hale cut inside, rolled wings level, and pointed his nose where he knew the German would be in 3 seconds, not where he was now. The enemy fighter appeared right on schedule. Hale fired in a 2-second burst, just as the German pilot realized he was flying into a waiting crossfire. The rounds ripped through the cockpit area. The canopy flew off. The fighter pitched downward, wobbling, then entered a steep, smoking dive from which no parachute emerged. That made 6 kills on the day, 6 enemy aircraft downed by a man who had never been credited with even one before sunrise. The exhilaration lasted exactly as long as it took Hale to glance at his fuel gauge. The needle was now deep into the danger zone, hovering above a red line that meant one terrible thing. If he didn't turn for home now, he wouldn't make it back. But the sky around him still burned with battle. The bomber stream was under renewed attack from a fresh wave of German fighters that had climbed into position to intercept the withdrawal. One B-17 below him was trailing a long, thick plume of smoke, its left wing punctured, a fire burning near engine number 2. It had fallen behind the main formation, crippled, alone, and 3 enemy fighters were curving in like sharks smelling blood. Hale knew the escort's doctrine. They were to guard the formation, not stragglers. But he also knew something else. Men inside that bomber were still alive, still fighting, and if he could buy them 2 more minutes, their gunners might just keep the aircraft in the air long enough to limp out of the worst of the flak and interception zones. He checked his ammo. Less than 400 rounds per gun, half his belts gone, maybe more. His fuel situation screamed at him to leave. His conscience refused. He rolled and dove toward the wounded fort. The 3 German fighters, a pair of Bf-109s and a single Focke-Wulf, noticed him a second too late. They had expected the escorts to stay with the main body, not break off for a single limping target. Hale came in from high and behind, the sun now at his back, and caught the trailing 109 first. He fired a short burst at 500 yards, walked the tracers into the enemy's tail, and watched the stabilizer shear off. The 109 snapped into an uncontrollable spin, its pilot's frantic attempts to recover ending in a cloud bank that swallowed the aircraft whole. 7. The other 2 fighters broke in opposite directions, executing a scissors maneuver meant to force Hale into a split-second choice that would expose his own flank to the second attacker. Hale refused their script. Instead of chasing either, he rolled his Thunderbolt into a barrel roll that carried him above their crossing paths, then dropped back down toward the Focke-Wulf, which was now swinging around to re-attack the bomber. The German pilot, focused on the bigger kill, misjudged Hale's position by a single, fatal second. Hale's guns lit, a half-second burst at a steep angle from above. Rounds slammed into the fighter's wing root and cockpit. The engine burst into flames. The aircraft rolled over and plunged earthward, trailing a greasy column of black smoke. 8. The remaining 109, realizing he was now alone against an escort fighter that had clearly found its rhythm, broke off. Instead of turning back into the fight, he dove for the deck, boosting away in the hope of using raw speed to escape. Here, finally, the Thunderbolt's infamous weight became an advantage the German could not match. Hale dove after him. The P-47 screamed downward, the airframe shuddering, the needle edging toward 450 km/s. The 109 was fast, sleek, perfectly tuned for high-speed flight, but it had a liquid-cooled inline engine, a weak point wrapped in a fragile skin of aluminum and glycol lines. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, carried its air-cooled radial engine like a shield in the nose, and right now, that shield was a battering ram. Hale closed in. The range shrank. 800 yards, 600, 400. He could see the German pilot craning his head back, eyes wide behind his canopy, disbelief mixing with rage as the clumsy American brute gained on him in a vertical chase that by all physics should have favored the lighter plane. Hale steadied his aim and squeezed the trigger one more time. The last burst of the mission was almost surgical. A short, controlled salvo, less than a second of fire. Tracers clipped the 109's tail, walked forward and found the engine cowling. The inline snapped to a stop in mid-air, the propeller freezing as if hit by a giant invisible hand. Smoke burst from the nose. The entire aircraft pitched up violently, then rolled onto its back, dead engine dragging it into a slow, unwilling fall. A canopy flew open. A small figure tumbled out and a parachute bloomed minutes before the aircraft hit the ground far below. 9 enemy aircraft destroyed in less than an hour by a pilot whose name had never appeared on a single Eastern Front kill list, flying a plane his own side had called a liability. The high of that moment lasted exactly as long as it took Hale to remember his fuel. He glanced down at the gauge and felt ice slide into his veins. The needle was now kissing the red, barely above the empty mark, and he was still deep over enemy territory. Below him, the wounded B-17 he'd saved staggered westward, trailing smoke but still flying, its crew no doubt counting every turn of its slowly failing propellers. Hale throttled back, nursing the engine, leaning the mixture until it was just this side of a stall. The Thunderbolt's big heart rumbled grudgingly, as if offended at being denied full power. Hale set his nose for a shallow climb toward the retreating bomber stream and keyed his radio. "Lead. This is Blue 3. I'm Winchester and low on fuel, trying to rejoin." Static. Then a burst of chaotic chatter, reports of losses, calls for help, scrambled vectors to rally points. No clear response. Many of the original escort had already turned back. Others were gone, shot down, missing, or crippled and limping for safety like the wounded fort below. Hale made a decision. He dropped into formation alongside the damaged bomber, slightly below and off its right wing, and matched its speed. If he was going to go down, he'd go down where gunners could at least watch his back. The long flight home began. Minute by agonizing minute, the landscape rolled beneath them. Patchwork fields, rivers, small towns, roads with tiny threads of vehicles. Flak guns opened up half-heartedly as they crossed key points. Bridges, rail lines, known approaches, but most of the heavy defenses had been oriented toward the main bomber stream. Hale kept his Thunderbolt weaving slightly, enough to throw off any belated gunner with good aim, but not enough to waste precious fuel. Sweat ran down his back despite the freezing air at altitude. His left hand rested lightly on the throttle, making micro-adjustments, coaxing every remaining drop from the tanks. He knew the numbers. At their current power setting and altitude, a healthy P-47 could just make it back to the channel with a safety margin. But his aircraft was no longer healthy. Holes pocked the wings. Fuel had been lost too. Cannon hits earlier. The engine's performance was unstable, manifold pressure occasionally dipping for no apparent reason before surging back. They reached the French coast just before noon. Below them, white lines of surf traced the shoreline like chalk on a blackboard. Far ahead, past the haze, lay England. Hale's fuel needle was now somewhere beneath the red line, the gauge nearly useless, but he felt the truth in the subtle changes of the engine's tone, in the way the aircraft responded with a fraction of its earlier eagerness. The bomber beside him droned on, its wounded engine coughing intermittently but holding. In the distance, he could finally make out the faint silhouette of a British coastline. Home. Maybe. At that exact moment, as if the war refused to let him leave easily, Hale's engine coughed. Just once. A deep, ugly shudder that rattled the frame and sent a momentary drop in power through the entire aircraft. The propeller stuttered, then caught again. But the voice that had been whispering doom in the back of Hale's mind all morning now screamed, "You are not going to make it." He checked his altitude. 10,000 feet. Enough to glide for a while if the engine quit entirely. Enough to ditch in the channel if he had to. Enough to die in water so cold it would freeze his muscles solid in minutes. He tightened his harness, took a slow breath, and scanned the sky one more time, making sure no late-arriving German fighters were stalking the wounded formation for easy kills. That's when he saw it. Far behind them, lower and closing fast, a single dark speck against the glittering surface of the sea, climbing gently toward their altitude. At first, it was impossible to tell whether it was friend or foe. A lone fighter returning? A damaged comrade catching up? The shape grew larger. Wing shape. Tail. Wingtips. Then, as it rolled slightly in a climbing turn, the sunlight caught its wings just enough for Hale to see the dark cross painted on the underside. One last German. Hale's stomach dropped. His ammo was nearly gone. His fuel reserve was an illusion kept alive by hope and habit. The bomber he'd been shepherding was barely holding altitude and had no chance of outrunning anything. And now, out over the unforgiving gray of the channel, with England finally in sight, a single Focke-Wulf was coming to finish what the others had failed to do. Hale looked at the bomber. He looked at his gauges. He looked at the approaching fighter. Then he shoved the throttle forward one more time, feeling the big, wounded Thunderbolt respond with a pained roar as he turned back toward the enemy, flying directly away from safety and into one more fight his aircraft was never supposed to survive. The German fighter kept climbing, its silhouette growing darker and sharper against the pale glare of the channel. And for a brief, unreal moment, Hale felt as if the entire war had narrowed down to just two machines suspended between sea and sky. One carrying a starving engine and emptying fuel tanks, the other fresh, aggressive, and hunting. The Focke-Wulf pilot knew exactly what he was seeing. A wounded escort, slow, out of ammunition, separated from the main group. Easy prey. Hale rolled his shoulders once, easing the tension out of muscles that had been locked for over an hour, and nudged the nose of his Thunderbolt slightly upward, presenting the illusion of strength even as the engine began to shiver with exhaustion beneath the cowling. At 2,000 yards, the German opened fire. Red-orange tracers arced past Hale's canopy, close enough that he could see their corkscrew paths through the air. One round slammed into the right wing near the aileron, punching a clean hole through the aluminum skin. Another struck the forward fuselage with a ringing metallic thud that vibrated through the cockpit floor. Hale didn't flinch. He did the only thing he had left. He turned toward the attack instead of away from it. The two fighters closed fast, head-on once again, the space between them collapsing in seconds. Hale waited, counting the heartbeat between each of the Germans' bursts. The P-47 was almost out of breath now, the engine struggling to give him even this last surge of speed. At 600 yards, he squeezed what little power remained from the throttle. At 400 yards, he centered the German in his windscreen. At 300 yards, he fired. Only 2 of his guns answered. The others were silent, out of ammunition, jammed, dead. But the 2 that still worked spat a thin line of fire that streaked straight into the Focke-Wulf's nose. Hale saw the tracers vanish into the cowling, and a split second later the German aircraft belched thick white smoke as its engine seized violently. The propeller froze. The fighter snapped into a wild, tumbling roll and dropped straight down toward the water. 9 kills had become 10. Hale didn't chase. He couldn't. The Thunderbolt's engine coughed again, this time harder, and the propeller windmilled uselessly as combustion died inside the cylinders. The big radial fell silent. Suddenly, there was only wind. The P-47 became a 14,000-pound glider with a dead engine, drifting above the gray emptiness of the English Channel. Hale's headset filled with his own breathing, loud and uneven in his ears. The altimeter ticked downward with cruel steadiness. 9,200 feet. 8,900. 8,500. He trimmed for best glide, pushed the nose down just enough to keep air moving over the wings, and aimed for the faint green-brown smear on the horizon that marked England's southern coast. The wounded B-17 he had been protecting droned on ahead of him, pulling slowly away now that Hale could no longer match its speed. He watched it go with mixed relief and regret. At least its crew would live. His own fate was now written in the slow mathematics of altitude versus distance. At 6,000 feet, the truth set in. He wasn't going to make land. The Thunderbolt simply didn't glide like a lighter fighter. It carried too much armor, too much metal, too much engine that was now just dead weight in its nose. Hale adjusted his glide angle, tried a different trim setting, tested the rudder. Nothing changed the brutal equation. The water below was rushing closer, textured now with visible waves and rolling whitecaps. He prepared to ditch. Training took over where fear could have paralyzed him. He loosened his shoulder harness just enough to allow forward movement without flinging himself into the instrument panel. He jettisoned the canopy, the plexiglass sliding away in the rush of cold air. He made sure his life vest was armed. He tightened his grip on the control stick and aligned himself parallel to the swell, searching for the trough between 2 wave crests where impact would be least violent. At 1,000 feet, the channel filled his entire world. At 300 feet, he lifted the nose slightly. At 50 feet, the Thunderbolt struck. The impact was brutal. Water exploded up around the fuselage in a towering wall. The aircraft skipped once like a thrown stone, slammed again, and then tore apart as the weight of the engine ripped forward through the cockpit structure. The force threw Hale forward, snapping the remaining harness straps and hurling him into the freezing sea as the broken remains of his fighter disappeared beneath the surface in a choking storm of bubbles and oil. The cold hit like a physical blow. It stole his breath instantly, burning his lungs, shocking his muscles into violent, uncontrollable spasms. For several terrifying seconds he couldn't move at all, his body locked by the shock of water barely above freezing. Then instinct broke through. He kicked upward, fighting numb legs and thrashing arms toward a patch of pale light shimmering above him. Hale broke the surface, gasping. Waves slapped his face. The smell of fuel and burned oil clung to the air. Debris bobbed around him, twisted aluminum, insulation, a fragment of his canopy drifting like a shard of glass. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to fight the rising panic, and pulled the inflation toggles on his vest. With a sharp hiss, the life jacket expanded around his chest. He was alive. But he was alone, floating in hostile water, with enemy coastlines not far behind him and friendly ones agonizingly distant. Every minute in that sea cut survival odds in half. He began to drift. For nearly 30 minutes, the channel tossed him like a forgotten object. Waves rolled him onto his back, then onto his side. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. His fingers stiffened until he could barely curl them. The sky overhead was a pale, indifferent blue, streaked with the thin contrails of aircraft that would never know he was here. Then, faintly at first, he heard it. An engine. Not the deep thunder of a fighter, but the chugging growl of a surface craft. Hale turned his head weakly, blinking salt from his eyes, scanning the rolling water. At first he saw nothing. Then, between two wave crests, a low, squat silhouette appeared, dark against the glittering surface. A British rescue launch. He raised one arm with what felt like the last strength in his body and let it drop again, unsure if they could even see him. Moments stretched unbearably. The shape grew larger. He saw the white wake spreading behind it. He heard shouted voices. Hands grabbed him. Strong arms hauled him over the side and collapsed him onto a wooden deck slick with spray. Someone cut open his flight suit. Someone else wrapped him in blankets. A sailor pressed a metal cup against his lips. "Drink, sir. Slow, slow." Hale drank and lived. The official tally came 2 days later. 9 confirmed kills in a single mission. It was a number that didn't make sense even to veteran fighter aces who had flown hundreds of sorties. The intelligence officers checked gun camera footage until the reels were worn thin. They matched crash reports, bomber crew testimonies, radar logs. The score held. 9. 1 mission. 1 Thunderbolt. 1 pilot who had been told his plane was a death trap barely weeks earlier. News traveled fast through the fighter groups. The tone changed overnight. Mechanics stopped calling the P-47 a coffin. Pilots stopped begging for transfers to lighter fighters. Men who had once cursed its weight now studied its dive speed, its punishment tolerance, its 8-gun broadside that could dismember an enemy aircraft in a single trigger pull. The Thunderbolt hadn't changed. The understanding of what it was had. And Hale's name began to circulate. He spent 6 weeks recovering from hypothermia and bruised ribs. During that time, his squadron flew without him. Some didn't come back. Others returned with new respect for the same ungainly machine they once mocked. When Hale finally walked onto the airfield again, thin from illness and stiff with cold weather injuries that would never fully leave his joints, the men didn't joke. They saluted. 2 weeks later, he was back in the cockpit. And the war was far from finished. Robert Hale returned to the sky in October of 1943 with scars on his ribs, stiffness in his hands from the cold of the Channel, and a reputation that now followed him across every airfield he landed on. Men who had never met him knew his name. Pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt now asked him quiet questions before missions, about dive speed, about how far you could push the engine before it betrayed you, about what it felt like to look straight into an enemy cockpit and not blink. Hale didn't answer like a hero. He answered like a tired man who had survived something he hadn't expected to survive. The war, however, didn't care about reputations. By the time Hale returned to active duty, the air war over Europe had intensified into a relentless machine. Bomber formations were pushing deeper into Germany. Targets were no longer coastal rail yards and U-boat pens, but industrial hearts: Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Leipzig. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, but it was far from broken. New enemy pilots arrived younger and more desperate. Flak belts thickened around every major city, and each mission now carried odds that every pilot understood but never spoke aloud. Sooner or later, luck would run out. Hale flew escort again. Mission after mission, he watched the sky fill with contrails and fire. He saw bombers break apart under flak bursts so violent they looked like invisible giants swatting aircraft from the air. He saw German fighters dive into American formations with the fury of men who knew they were fighting a losing war, but intended to sell every inch of it in blood. The Thunderbolt proved itself again and again, soaking up hits that would have destroyed lighter fighters, diving out of impossible positions, hauling damaged wings and wounded engines back to England when no other aircraft could. Hale scored 3 more victories that winter, not 9 in a day, no miracle repeats, just the slow, grinding arithmetic of air combat. 1 enemy here, 1 there, each kill harder than the last, each loss heavier than the one before. By January of 1944, his official tally stood at 12 confirmed kills. But numbers stopped meaning much. What he counted instead were the faces missing from the ready room, the empty bunks, the pilots who didn't walk back from the operations board after debrief because their status had changed from missing to confirmed. He watched replacements arrive who were barely out of training, their hands steady on the outside and shaking under the table. He recognized the look in their eyes. It was the same one he had worn months earlier before the Channel tried to claim him. And then, in March of 1944, the war came for him again. The mission was routine by the standards of 1944. Escort bombers toward Berlin, sweep ahead of the formation, break up interceptors, bring as many men home as possible. Nothing about it sounded heroic. Everything about it was deadly. 200 bombers, nearly 100 escorts, hundreds of enemy fighters waiting beyond the Rhine. The fight exploded over Germany with terrifying speed. Flak climbed like black towers through the bomber stream. German fighters punched through the escort screen in layered attacks. Hale was leading a four-plane element when they were jumped from above by a group of Bf-109s using the sun as cover. He broke instinctively, rolling into a climbing turn to avoid the first pass, then diving after the second attacker as tracers stitched the air where he had been moments earlier. He fired once. The German fighter fell away trailing smoke. He fired again seconds later. Another spiraled downward, wing torn open. Then, in the chaos of rolling aircraft and twisting contrails, a third enemy fighter flashed across Hale's nose at a range so close he saw the pilot's mouth open inside the canopy. Hale fired reflexively, and at the same instant felt his Thunderbolt shudder violently as cannon shells punched through the cockpit area. The world turned white. Pain erupted through his left side. The controls went slack in his hands. Warning lights exploded across his instrument panel in a constellation of red and amber. Smoke flooded the cockpit. The Thunderbolt rolled inverted and began to fall. Hale tried to pull the stick. Nothing happened. The control cables had been severed. The P-47 was no longer an aircraft, it was a falling object. At 14,000 feet, Hale fought the stick again with both hands, his vision narrowing as blood soaked into his flight suit. The aircraft didn't respond. The spin tightened. Blackness crept into the edges of his sight. He reached for the canopy release. It jammed. The frame had twisted under impact. With what little strength remained, Hale kicked against the canopy. Once, twice, 3 times. The fourth kick shattered the plexiglass outward in a spray of fragments. Wind tore through the cockpit like a living thing. He pulled himself forward, wedging his shoulders against the cockpit rim, then pushed. The Thunderbolt fell away beneath him. Freefall was silent. For a few endless seconds, there was no engine noise, no gunfire, no vibration, just cold air and the distant roar of battle far above. Then the chute snapped open and wrenched his body into a violent jerk as the canopy blossomed above him. Hale was alive again. He descended into a Germany that was burning. He spent the rest of the war in captivity. Interrogations came first, then isolation. Then the slow march of time measured only in meals and roll calls and rumors drifting through prison barracks like smoke. Hale learned that his squadron had survived the mission, that the bombers had reached their targets, that his war, at least in the sky, had ended. He would not fly again until the world changed. And it did. On May 8, 1945, the guards at his camp stood stiffly at attention and announced what Hale had barely dared to hope for. The war in Europe was over. The gates opened days later. He walked out of captivity, thinner, slower, and carrying memories that would never fully release their grip. When he returned to the United States, there were no parades. The war was still raging in the Pacific. The country was already focused forward. Hale was handed citations, a handful of medals, quiet handshakes from men who understood what the papers could never fully print. 12 confirmed aerial victories, 9 in a single mission, 2 aircraft lost beneath him, 1 life spared twice by water and chance. He left the Air Force in 1947. Like many men who had lived too intensely too young, he struggled to fit into a world that moved at peacetime speed. Noise startled him. Silence unsettled him more. He married. He worked. He tried to be ordinary. But the sky never fully let him go. Years later, when asked in a small veterans' hall what it felt like to shoot down 9 enemy aircraft in one mission, Hale paused for a long time before answering. Then he said quietly, "It felt like getting away with something the universe doesn't usually allow." The P-47 Thunderbolt never became famous for elegance. It never earned the nickname of a ballerina or a falcon or a dancer. It remained what it had always been: heavy, loud, brutal. A flying engine wrapped in guns and armor, a machine that survived not because it was delicate, but because it was relentless. At the beginning of the war, pilots feared it. By the end of the war, pilots trusted it with their lives. And for one long morning over Europe, a man who had been told he was flying a death trap proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the sky is not speed or grace or reputation, but the will to point a battered machine straight into the storm and refuse to look away. Robert Hale died in 1992. His name does not appear in most textbooks. No blockbuster films were made about him. But somewhere beneath the quiet hum of museum hangars and the fading echoes of wartime skies, the story remains of the day a single pilot in a broken Thunderbolt went head-on into impossible odds and came back with 9 victories and a lesson written in fire. They called his plane a death trap, until he used it to survive what no one else should have.